Okay, so good morning, and I apologize if my dog decides to start barking. He's normally better than that, but who knows? Morning. We are going today to see two courts instead of saying two artists because they're more than two. But we're going to concentrate on Holbein in the court of England and the Clouet family, father and son, in at the court of Francis I and his son Henry II. So I put there the two actually friends slash rivals here next to one another as a really good representation of these extraordinary costumes of the Renaissance. So let me show you first the timeline. As you know, I like to do that. In yellow, we have here the Northerners. In green, we have the Italian painters that are going to really cast an influence on these artists. And then we have at the bottom the timelines in red for the court of England and in blue for the court of France. So let's see. The three big names that are influential in portraiture are Leonardo, Raphael, and Titian. And you can see immediately to me what is striking in these is look at the long life and career of Titian compared to the extremely short life of Raphael, though he was probably the most influential. In the Netherlands and in Germany, the in portraits we have Roger van der Weyden, and prior to him, a little older, is Jan van Eyck, but he didn't fit on this timeline, so I just mentioned him. Of course, Dürer, and particularly after he went to Italy, came back with some of the different definitions of the Renaissance and really brought that into Northern Europe. So when we look at the works of Hans Holbein, who we're going to see soon, we see how contemporary they were, but I don't think they ever met. Dürer being mostly in Nuremberg, Hans Holbein is going to work from Basel in Switzerland and then move to England for a majority of his career. In France, and these two might have met, while Hans was in France, Jean Clouet and his son Francois Lui, who were, Jean was probably born in Brussels, Belgium, was from a family of painters already there, and I'll talk about him in length after that. So this corresponds, as you can see, I just put Henry VII as a reference, and there's a contrast actually with Henry VIII, who we see there. And Hans Holbein is going to cover a good part of Henry VIII's reign as a king. Just for reference, we see that Edward VI will succeed him and then marry for a short period of time. And then, of course, it's going to be Elizabeth I. In France, we have Charles VIII, which corresponds roughly and part of Louis XII, the reign. And then Louis XII is going to die without children and will be succeeded by Francois I, who is was a far relative of his. Francois I will be succeeded by his son Henry II. And then Henry II has three sons. And the first one I didn't even mention, he didn't even reign for a year. It's Francis II, Francois II, then Charles the Ninth, and then Henry III. So this I like to see them in time equivalency. So let's talk about Henry VIII. He was born in 1491 at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, Kent. He had an elder brother, Arthur, who died in 1502 at the age of 15. There was a disease at the time that has not yet been identified. It was qualified of sweating sickness. And a lot of adults, but mostly children, died of it. radically, and so we're not quite sure. He had been married to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the King of Spain, and died literally 20 weeks after his marriage. In 1503, Henry lost his mother, Elizabeth of York, and he will become king after the death of his father, Henry VII, because his brother, elder brother, Arthur, had died before him. So he wasn't really expected to become king, as often happens, by the way. The interesting problem is going to be his first wife, because in fact, it was Catherine of Aragon. And to keep the peace between Spain and England, Henry was really pushing, Henry VII was pushing his son, Henry VIII, to marry Catherine, who had barely been married to Arthur, and because of their age, they assumed, though there's controversy on that the marriage hadn't been consumed. So with a license from the Pope anyway, Henry will marry Catherine of Aragon as his first wife. Just to give a few facts of his life and important things, at least for us, that he sanctioned the complete destruction of shrines to saints in 1540. And in 1542, dissolved the England remaining monasteries and transferred, of course, the property to the crown. I also forgot to put, but here in 1526, he is going to create the Church of England when he decides to quit Catholicism because of his dispute over the annulment of his marriage to his wife, Catherine. This is by the point. I don't know why I didn't write it. 1547, he will die a very sick man. He had all kinds of ailments. He will die in the Palace of Whitehall. So his wives, because when we think of Henry, we always think of his wives. So the first one was Catherine of Aragon. He married her in 1509, and the marriage was annulled finally in 1533 by his own making. The Pope never agreed to do it. From that marriage, there was issue, and that was Mary Tudor, who had a brief reign between 1553 and 58. He annulled the marriage with Catherine of Aragon, who unfortunately finished her life pretty miserably, and he decided to get married with Anne Boleyn. As you know, she was the lady in waiting of Catherine of Aragon, and they married in 1533, but very quickly there were rumors that she was having affairs, and of course a lot of people who didn't like her really pushed these gossips. So the marriage was annulled in 1536. As you know, she lost her life shortly after that. From that union came Elizabeth I, who was queen from 1558 to 1603. The third wife was apparently quite a love for him. It was Jane Seymour. He married her in 1536. And unfortunately for her, she died after giving birth to the son, Edward VI, in 1537, just a few days after that. So Henry was looking around, trying to find the proper wife, and his prime minister, Cromwell, decided to push him to go to the German family of the Clouet family, and they were two sisters. He sent Holbein. He sent Holbein to Germany to make a portrait of the two sisters. And when Holbein came back, he decided on Anne, and this was a real problem because when Anne arrived, and they got married in 1540, very quickly he realized he didn't care for her. She was kind of a bland type of woman, and must have been reciprocal because Anne had no attraction for him either. By that time, by the way, he was pretty obese, and they mutually agreed on an annulment in 1540, and she stayed and lived extremely well in England after that. He fell in love then with Catherine Howard, who was also a lady in waiting and the daughter of an important man at the court. He married her the same year, and she died in delivering a child that was stillborn in 1541. And then finally he married Catherine Parr. So after Anne de Clèves, he decided he was going to go English and stayed with English women, and then married Catherine Parr, who he married in 1543 and who survived him. He died in 47. So this gives you an idea. We're going to see mostly Jane Seymour, Anne of Clèves, and Catherine Howard among the works of Hans Holbein. So let's look at Hans Holbein now. In 1497, he was born in Augsburg, son of a painter, Hans Holbein the Elder, as a contrast to him, who was very known and did a lot of works. He began some independent work in Basel, Switzerland. He actually had a brother that we will see soon, who was also an artist. And both of them moved to Basel, Switzerland, because at that time it was a very active printing town, and there was a lot of atmosphere in it. So around 1515, they went there. And from there, he left in 1517 to northern Italy and learned a lot there. He spent about a year in Italy, saw works by Leonardo and by the Venetian artists of the time. He came back and in 1519 entered the Painters Corporation, married a tanner's widow who was a little older than him and had a young son, and became a burgher of Basel in 1520. So really well established. A few years later, he took a trip to France. And from there on, we see really a development of his religious subjects and portraiture. In 26, following very severe iconoclastic riots and very strict censorship of the press over the city, this comes with the Reformation, he left Basel because, of course, for an artist, suddenly you have a whole series of new currents that come that actually just try to avoid any picture, particularly religious ones. He wasn't very good for him, and he didn't like the atmosphere of censorship that explained. He was told by his friend Erasmus, who was a great scholar, who we'll see soon, that England was in need of artists. They didn't have really local artists. So in 1526, he traveled by the way of the Netherlands to England, where he will become very successful. In 28, he came back to Basel for 4 years, where he continued some important and not religious work for the town council. He had got married, as we know, and the poor woman remained behind. So she was alone for the 2 years he was in England, came back and made a few more children. And then in 32, despite the fact that the Basel administration really tried to keep him there, he decided to go back to England, left his wife and children behind, and spent the last 11 years of his life primarily in England, where he died in 43. Here is a drawing by Hans Holbein the Elder, so the father. I'm sorry, but I have to. Oui, maman, je donne une classe. Okay. So Hans Holbein the elder made a drawing showing Hans Holbein the younger on the right, and then the other son Ambrosius. This is a lovely silver point on white coated paper that shows the two sons. And as I say, both of them went to Basel. And then it looks like Ambrosius must have died because nothing is said about him after that. In Basel, as it was a big printing town, Holbein did a lot of printing work as well as paintings that you don't expect. We'll see that, literally house paintings on the outside. So this is part of the interesting project. This is actually a study for a print that shows a praying fool, showing a peasant there coming by, that big image of Saint Christopher, and showing these close to idolatry type of attitudes that the poor and uneducated people had towards some images, and this became one of the big points of contention with Reformation, of course. One extraordinary work he did is the Zum Tanz house. This is a reconstruction of the house, how it would have looked. And in fact, what you see mostly is a trompe-l'œil, so fool the eye type of painting. This is actually almost entirely flat. The only thing that isn't is this part where you have these lines drawn that would be doors and windows. And then behind here, the same thing. But all the figures that dancing there are just is one of the old reproduction of the wall that you see over there, showing people really enjoying themselves dancing. This is why it's zum Tanz, which means to dance. And we see all these figures of the little dogs and people at the balcony. This is all trompe-l'œil painting, so absolutely flat. Just make you believe that there is columns and beautiful architecture behind it. Unfortunately, the house was demolished in the 18th century. It was let go once it didn't have a real reason to be, and so it was degraded and then finally demolished in the 18th century. But very quickly, Holbein is going to assert himself as quite a portraitist. And as there were not too many religious paintings to be had at that time, portraiture became a very important way of making money. So this is some of the biggest patron that Holbein had in Basel. Actually, Jacob Meyer, that you see on the left here, is going to become the mayor of Basel, and despite the fact he's not part of the aristocracy, but by his shrewd work, he made his way through the hierarchy of the city. So in this portrait, we start seeing some Italian influence, even the costume. Of course, Switzerland is closer to Italy, so it's a kind of bringing in easily some of these influences. But just the way that shirt that he has under his jacket is very typically Italian. And of course, the whole architecture behind both sitters, very typically Renaissance architecture with the coffered ceiling and the columns that you see there. This is very much inspired by Dürer, who would had gone to Italy twice by that time and brought back a lot of engravings and a lot of writings. He did a lot of writing too, inspired by what we saw in Italy. So what we see in portraits is the line that is taking over the colors. The colors are there but it's not as painterly as his later portraits. The lady that you see there is actually the second wife of Jacob Meyer, Dorothea Meyer, sorry. But definitely you can see by the beautiful costumes that they want to show their, display their wealth. He's also showing a coin there, which shows that he had the power and the authority to mint money in Basel, which required a special authorization. And the quantity of golden rings also on his fingers is a display of wealth. Also, as you can see, pointing to his wife, gently to show how beautiful and well-dressed she is. Very quickly, this is going to make him known. And the people are going to start coming to him. This is another portrait showing that the sitter here on the cartouche shows that the sitter is 22. It's always interesting because they always look much older. It is said almost as a direct speech here that say that the portrait shows his resemblance, and this is the way he looked. The young man is really looking at him with pride. His costume is beautiful. And again, this is a statement of wealth. One of the most stunning portraits that we have is the one of Boniface Ammerbach. And okay, sorry for that. Bonifacius Ammerbach's portrait is really a departure from what we've seen before to something much more deep in the understanding of the figure. He's quite an interesting man. He had studied both law and classical antiquity in Basel and then in Freiburg. He had gone to Avignon in 1520 to continue his studies. He actually ended up in 1525 with a chair in Roman law at a very important at the time University of Basel. And so by just the costume all in black, that's very typical of the scholars of the time. But there is, despite the profile painting, an understanding of the depth of the figurehead. This is also made the year that Holbein is going to become a master in the Painters Guild zum Himmel, which was the Painter Guild in Basel. Very different is what we can say, is it a religious painting or not? It is supposed to be the body of the dead Christ in the tomb. And this is a strikingly realistic representation of Christ with the beginning of decay of around the wound at his hand and at his feet. This was most probably a predella, so that bottom part of the painting at the bottom of an altarpiece or other painting. The story goes that this was painted after the body of a man that had drowned in the Rhine River. But this is, of all his work, probably the most striking image. Actually, Dostoevsky, who saw the painting, even mentioned it in his writing. It is also, I think, part of what was happening with the first phase of the Reformation, which was pretty brutal, caused a lot of death and a lot of misery. And so this is kind of a portrayal of what's happening around him. One of the biggest figures he met in Basel is Erasmus of Rotterdam, who was one of the greatest European scholar of the 16th century. The main thing of his studies was the philological method that he used that was actually already pioneered by Italian humanists, where he really tried to lay the groundwork for historical critic study of the past. And this is really trying to make sense of the incredible text that had come from the classical period, and to make sense of them within the context of the church and the Bible, and try to show that they were not antithesis, that there was a lot of values that were similar. And so Erasmus, in a sense, is a very independent person. He's, in the sense, he's influential. He was influential in pushing people to start the Reformation. He didn't believe that it was going to cause that fracture with the Catholic Church. But he was resentful also of a lot of the corruption existing in the Catholic Church. So he was looked by both sides actually with suspicion, because he wasn't taking any side. He is actually, here you can see him writing, which was one of the big time, that time consuming that he was doing. He was writing a lot. He did edit, in a sense, the translation of the Bible in Latin by St. Jerome, but he also made a lot of commentaries on the epistles of St. Paul and others. And this is, by the way, on the left, the comments on the Gospel of St. Luke that was dated 1523, so at the time of the painting. The painting on the right, I think, is extremely striking by the textures that you can find in it, as well as the incredible volume of that man that is very ascetic. If you look at his features, he has the prominent nose, but also high cheekbones and a very soft look on his face, though apparently he could be pretty lively whenever it came to philosophical discussions. These type of portraits that exist in multiple copies and in engravings and so on were known to be exchanged between scholars. They would have collections of other scholars in their studies that were kind of inspiration for their work. Here's another version of Erasmus, this time by a Flemish painter, Quentin Massys, that dates from about the same time, with a different flavor, just that very pensive look of Erasmus, but shows that the very similitude, if you want, of the face is well observed by Holbein as well as Quentin Massys. He was painted by many, many people. As I mentioned, around 24, he's going to go to France, and he's going to, of course, go around, look at the art that was quite numerous around the court. And these are two what we call priants, so people that are praying. And this is around their tomb, actually, but you have the two life-size figures that are kneeled and praying. And he did actually, he did these two drawings of the Jeanne de Boulogne on the left and the Jean-Duc de Berry on the right. And it's quite interesting how he brings them to life more than the statues were. And this is where we say there is a paragon. There was the dispute between painters and sculptors, who was the most important and the most faithful to the figure. So the sculptor would say, we are three-dimensional, so you can go around just like a real body or a real object. But on the other hand, the painters could say, I can pretend that it is 3D, but look, I can put eyelashes and eyebrows and give you a sense of the colors and the expression that is very rare in sculpture at that time. A little note is that, first of all, Jean Duc de Berry was the brother to the king, and was the man who commissioned. He was a great art patron. He's the one who commissioned the Trésor of the Duke of Berry, that extraordinary book of hours that bears his name. So quite an important figure. These tombs were pretty much demolished during the French Revolution. And thanks to the existing drawings by Holbein, the sculptures were rebuilt, and in great part following his drawing. Before leaving Germany, he's going to paint different kinds, and this is a rather unusual subject in his career, is Lais of Corinth. She was, as they say in Greek, an hetaira, which is a courtesan, but particularly known for her beauty. So she's a classical figure, but dressed in contemporary German costume. And she's shown there with all her beauty, but with her hand towards you and the money there that are going to be paid for her services. There is absolutely no doubt that he has seen works by Leonardo, and there's a very dramatic influence of Leonardo in many ways. While he's in Basel, he's also going to produce quite a large work of 41 woodcuts on the Danse Macabre. And the Danse Macabre is actually related to the Book of Death, the Dance of Death. It's always showing some skeleton that are intruding in the life of everybody, and showing that you can do what you want. You can be at your field, or you can be enjoying being courted by somebody. Death is just behind the corner and can hit you before you know. This was very fashionable at the time. There are a lot of artists that did a different representation of death, but this is a particularly successful one that was published by Holbein. So he decides that he's going to go to England, pushed by his friend and the friends of Erasmus. And Erasmus gives him a letter for Thomas More, who was one of his closest friends and also a great humanist. And so this is through Thomas More that Holbein will be introduced to society in England. Thomas More, of course, was a humanist and statesman, was Chancellor of England, and unfortunately for him, he was beheaded for refusing to accept King Henry as head of the Church of England. He's, by the way, recognized as a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. But he was the most important patron that Holbein had during the first stay in London. He was one of the moving spirits of the revival of learning and letters in the early years of Henry VIII's reign. The King Henry is quite a strange character, because he really comes as a contrast to his father, Henry VII, who was a rather stout and severe person who was very, really kept quite a low-key profile, didn't spend much money. And when Henry became king, it was just the opposite. But Henry also was keen in attracting foreign artists and intellectual, because it looked good. The court looked always better when you had some minds part of it. So here, in the way that Holbein represents Thomas More, he definitely is showing him in public figure with literally the costume that tells the position of the men within society. Though More was very particular in some things, and for example, he refused to have very ornamented cuffs and just wanted very strict ones. But he's wearing some of the chain that would have been given to him when he became part of the court of Henry. And that was actually very much a symbol of how you were chained to the king and you supposed to obey him completely. Holbein is going to be also known for the wonderful drawings that he will do. These were, of course, preparatory sketches that he would do of his sitters, and that often are actually representing the character of the person even better than the painting. So we will find multiple drawings by him, chalks on paper, that are very telling, and we'll see that with Clouet later on too. In this case, they are purely preparatory drawing for the painting. We'll see that in France, they will turn into works of art by themselves. As I say, Holbein was very close to Thomas More. Thomas More had a large family and was very much of a family man. So one of the interesting words, probably one of the first, what you would call conversation pieces, where the whole family is together, and you can imagine that maybe one is going to read a text and everybody is listening while they do some handiwork or whatever, embroidery or whatever. And so here, unfortunately, the original painting has disappeared. It was destroyed in the fire in Germany at the Schloss Kremsier, who was the residence of Count von Liechtenstein. And but here you can see the preparatory drawing by Holbein of that whole family, showing Holbein's father here, Holbein himself, his wife, his daughters and daughters-in-law, his son and his grandson. And then here is missing a figure that will be added later on, who is the great-grandson. And so each of them have a particular attitude, but it's really nice. We have a copy that was made, a later copy that was made of the painting on which we can rely and have an idea of how it would have looked. So this is by Roland Locky, the same composition, but this time, of course, in painting. Also an early clock at the back, and then beautiful bouquets that are in fact quite resembling what was done as a beginning of still lifes in the 16th century before it really took off in the 17th century. So from the More, Holbein is going to get in contact with different noble people that were part of the circles of the Moors and then closer to Henry. Here's the portrait of Sir Henry Guilford and his wife, Lady Mary Guilford. So these, though they are actually different sizes, as you can see by little, but it shows they definitely were conceived as a matching pair. You have actually the same rod that runs through the two images. The young woman that you see on the right is actually the second wife of Sir Henry Guilford, Mary Wotton. And she's painted here holding a book of hours in her hands and a rosary. The painting is interesting because the scale of the two figures is quite different. But definitely we have again the same message, a powerful man, rather stern, having actually a beautiful chain around the collar, very expensive clothes. that would have come from, the fabric would have come from the East. This comes in contrast with the next painting, which shows the portrait of William Warham, Archbishop of Canterbury. He is the one who actually had crowned the young royal couple of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. He remained attached to the Catholic faith all his life and saw, of course, the degradation when Henry decided that he was going to start to make the church independent from the Pope and started the Church of England, but insisted in being the head of the church, which really came against the grain of William Warham, who resented that. Luckily for him, he never was beheaded and he lived to the ripe age of 83. But the rendering of that man that seems to be so, has seen some hard time, in the sense he looks really tired. Then you have behind him the mitre of showing him as a bishop or an archbishop in this case. This is, by the way, painted with real gold, not just gold paint. And a very different portrait here is the portrait of a lady with a squirrel and a starling. These two must have something to do with her name, which unfortunately we don't know. And this painting was most probably part of a pair with a man's portrait, but we don't know who she is. But it is very interesting in the way Holbein painted on that solid blue background with just the starling looking at her and the little squirrel who is kind of coiled on her hands. A double portrait of Sir Thomas Gotself and his son John. Again, is part of that evolution of the young Holbein at the court of England. And here the portrait of Nikolas Katzer, who was born in Munich, studied in Cologne and Wittenberg. He was an astronomer, came to England by the way of the Netherlands, and became very highly considered in England, where he became the private astronomer at the service of Henry VIII. He was also appointed professor in Corpus Christi College, Oxford. And in many ways, this is a pivotal portrait for Holbein, when he starts really insisting on showing what people, putting the instrument of life, if you want, for these sitters, showing all their tools around them and making the whole decor a very interesting one. Also engaging the figure within the portrait. There is a subtlety of light that is now introduced in that portrait that we hadn't really seen before. At that time, in 1528, Holbein is going to go back to Basel and receive the commission from the same family of the Meyers for an altarpiece showing the Madonna that has been since called the Darmstadt Madonna, with donor portraits. And you can recognize Meyer on the left and his second wife, whereas the first wife is shown in profile, so we can barely see her. The Meyer had seen difficult times, probably also by the introduction of the Reformation in Basel, but also because they lost their children. The daughter that you see here in profile is the only child that survived. The two young boys that you see, one barely one, and the other one in 7 years old, were had both died by the time the painting was made. And the young woman originally had flowing hair, and that was changed with a coif because she became betrothed and then couldn't show her hair anymore at that time. There are different interesting points in that painting. It's just, for example, the very natural way that to show the carpet. This carpet, by the way, that comes back regularly, this one and others, are called Holbein carpets because they are so typical of the ones he's using with these geometrical shapes. And here, if you want, it's kind of bundled at the foot of the young baby. That gives some life and some additional dimension. The Virgin is also very typical of what was shown in Germany at that time. It's called the Schutz Mantle build, which shows, in fact, the Virgin that comes as a protector. As you can see, she's covering with her coat the whole family and therefore offering them protection. The baby is beautiful. He's quite animated, and you see the beautiful foreshortening of his arm that is projected towards you. This is definitely, again, something that goes back to what he had seen in Italy when he traveled there. From that same short period of time comes an interesting portrait that actually is supposed to show the artist family. And this is that young widow that he had married, as you know, a few years before. That shows, and for me, I hadn't even looked at who she was when I saw the face of the two children and her. They all look so pitiful and so sad. And in fact, if you think about it, Holbein had just left for 2 years. And left her with 2 children on top of her own. And she was there. Probably he was providing the money, but life wasn't very much fun. We can date it around 1528 because while he's staying for 4 years in Basel, he's going to have 2 more children with her. And they don't appear here. So this is about the only date that would fit. But that painting remained with her. He left it behind when he went back to England. And apparently she got rid of it pretty quickly after he left, even before he died. Again, his reputation as a portraitist has followed him. He did a few portraits there, and then he decided to go back to England. But the atmosphere has changed a lot since the time he was there. So in a few years, everything had happened is that the annulment of the marriage with Catherine of Aragon, then the problem with Anne Boleyn, the whole religious difficulties with Henry becoming the head of the Church of England, all that really brought a lot of difficult atmosphere in London. And so the way he will go back is when he goes back to London, he gets very close to merchants, German merchants that were residing in London. And so he's going to produce a whole series of portraits of these German traders and merchants. This is probably one of the nicest. This is the merchant Georg Gizer. His name appears on a lot of letters here, but it's also again integrating the figure that is becoming very well adapted within his interior to a working place where you can see the fact he writes a lot. So you have an ink pot, you have some scales, you have here that round object has a rope coming out. You have seals around it, just some scales here. These are all objects with which Georg was working most of the day. So this is really just a beautiful, you have a Venetian vase, which means he was in trade with Italy. But there are also some carnations, and carnation denotes very typically a betrothal or a wedding. And indeed, Georg will get married 3 years later. On top of his head is a work in Latin that says nulla sine mero revoluptas, that you don't have no joy without sorrow. Another quite interesting portrait is he is a member of the Vedic family. It was possible to identify him by his heraldic ring that he wears there at the finger. But very, very simple portrait. The man is facing us directly. There's no profile, and he's looking directly to us. Again, part of the members of the Steelyard that were in London. One more, Derich Born, a change in the attitude. This is very Italian. We find that with Titian, we found that with Raphael and the Baldassare Castiglione. Again, all these were part of the Steelyard community in London. Moving towards the court, we have then the portrait of Thomas Cromwell, who was the prime minister to the king, a fierce man that was very instrumental in Reformation and also in bringing Anne Boleyn to the king. He will remain very close to the king until he made the big mistake of orienting him to Anne de Clèves. And when Anne de Clèves came as a disappointment, he was then moved away from the court, and then, unfortunately for him, was beheaded by the king too, who expressed regret later on. One of the most known painting by Holbein is definitely The Ambassadors. And this is really a striking painting. I'm going to move this to the other side so it doesn't get in the way. That extraordinary painting, which is full of symbolism and mystery, actually represents the ambassadors. And in fact, it's mostly one ambassador. They're definitely two scholars and much younger than you could believe. On one side, on the top of the table, you have the typical Holbein carpet from the center of Anatolia. Sorry, this is not what I wanted. And we have on the left Jean de Dinteville, who was ambassador of France to England. And then on the right, another Frenchman, de Selve, who is Georges de Selve, who was actually a bishop, both in their 20s, quite young men, but really we assume that had a very, very strong friendship. And we also know that de Selve is going to die very young after they return to France. They will go back to France and they'll be completely apart. And de Selve is going to die a few years after his return to France. But this is really that kind of painting of stressing the friendship between two men who understood one another very well. As I mentioned, a lot of symbolism. And so we have on top of the shelf, we have a celestial map. And then we have some dials, the celestial globe, as we say, and we have a cylindric dial here that gives the date as 11th of April when the painting was started. And then the polyhedron dial here gives 2 different times of the day. On the lower shelf, in front of the terrestrial globe, you have a German textbook here of arithmetic for merchants. And then we have the globe, and this is what I was going to show you, that actually shows in France policy where the young man de Danteville was from. There is a lute. Normally, typically, the lute has a connotation of love and sexual attraction. So we don't know what really the thing is, but it definitely shows the mastery of Holbein in his foreshortening. In front of the lute is also a song book that has to do a hymnal that is open at Martin Luther's hymn, "Come Holy Ghost, our souls inspire." And this, of course, offers hope of eternal life when dust returns to dust. It's almost like they have an idea that George de Sèvres is going to die so young. There are also a case of recorders there. And then a point that is quite interesting is also the fact that the string of the lute, you can't see it here, but has snapped. And this was typically an emblem of fragility. So a little bit of what you call the vanitas, the idea of life is going to go by so fast that death is always around the corner. But the very striking object is what lies here on the floor in front of the two. And this is really a kind of a game of perspective that was quite usual here. I'm going to show you before that the fact that there is a crucifix here on the wall, almost hidden by the curtains. And the dagger sheet here gives the age of the sitter, who is 29. So it is believed that that painting probably was destined to be in a staircase. And so that you would see it at an angle coming down or going up. And it is at that time that this object is going to show. So here is the hymnal, sorry for that. But just to give you what you can see with this object is when you need to be really looking, to be totally next to the painting and looking along the surface of it. And I'm going to try to show you what happens when you do that is now you can see that this image is actually a skull when it's perfectly against. This is the way the skull looks at it. These were some interesting skills that like to be shown by some very good artists, is that these ideas that you can distort with the way of lenses, you can distort the shape so that it's not legible when you see it like this, but once at an angle, you can understand the meaning of it. And of course, this has again to do, the skull is the vanitas, the idea of the fragility of life, but also might refer to something that is on the cap of the Danteville, where there is a skull on his cap, part of his coat of arms. This is called, by the way, anamorphic perspective, and or sometimes anamorphosis. Here is another example that was done in Germany. Erhard Schön was known for these. And in fact, what you see is a jumbled of lines and curve and so on are the portraits of Charles V, Ferdinand I, the Pope Clement VII, and Francis I. And again, I'm going to try to play with that oblique view to give you an idea. You now can read here the portrait of Charles V. This is Ferdinand I, his brother, and here the Pope Clement VII and Francis I of France. So these were the kind of games that people were playing in a sense. Some of the paintings by Holbein were more poetic. This is one of the most poetic of all the ones that he did. Is the portrait of Simon George. It's a tondo, so that kind of a round shape, 31 centimeters. It's about 12 inches in diameter. It's not a very large painting, but it's exquisite, with the kind of a slight smile on his lips, and the eyes also show some irony. The beautiful embroidered sleeve there, and that the carnation. And then again, is the idea that he is going to be betrothed, and that's probably the portrait that was made for it. I love the feather that follows the curve of the frame. In total contrast with that one is the very strong and majestic portrait of Charles de Soleil, Lord of Mohet, who was the French ambassador in London in 1534. Incredibly strong face, very square shoulders, extraordinary costume, but in all these shades of brown and white, absolutely beautiful. And again, more of the German Hilliard people that remain good customers of his. He's 30 years old, according to the paper. Moving towards the court of England, we now have here Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. He was a very powerful English noble, had a lot of high offices under Henry VIII. But he was a military commander. Howard was the brother-in-law of King Henry VII and the son of Thomas Howard. Again, we have the always present chains that have to show with the nobility, and then the baton, also proof of their commander grade. The Duke Anthony the Good of Lorraine, so Antoine le Bon de Lorraine, was a commander in the service of the French King Francis I. And though he wasn't present in England at the time that painting was made, it's believed that Holbein was working on a previous study that he had made of him, but also I think quite interesting in showing the character of the man. So moving now to Henry, because he is the king. He was represented in different ways. This is the only one that we have by the hand of Holbein, completely. Painting that was made around 1537, showing him with his very particular feature, where he's showing him without flattery. He shows that he's got these humorless eyes, rather hard eyes, very small, a very small mouth for the large face with flat cheek and almost no chin. The costume is, of course, beautiful. He's the king, lots of precious stones and embroidery and gold, but just a very simple blue background. This painting that was going to become a mural for him. Sorry, I think it was in the privy chamber, a private chamber accessible only for the more intimate members of the court in the Whitehall Palace. That unfortunately disappeared, but this was probably the project for the painting. Shows the king unusually standing with legs apart, that was supposed to show strength and power. And then, of course, this is the very known portrait of Henry VIII at age 49. Also was supposed to be a part of the prototypes for the mural that disappeared. There's a real image of power there, not of gentleness. A miniature that Holbein did. Holbein did a few miniatures, but he did this of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And of course, Solomon has the feature of Henry VIII. And one cannot see who the Queen of Sheba is because she turns her face towards him. This is a rather small piece, 22 by 18 centimeters. So it's a little bigger than a regular page. Holbein was asked by Henry to go around and sometimes paint the prospective wife or some of the real wife he had around or people of the court. So we do have some paintings. This is Jane Seymour in 1536. She was the third wife of the king. And she was the mother of Edward, who became King Edward VI. And she, of course, was successful in the sense that she brought the legitimate male heir to the throne. So apparently, Henry became attracted to Jane in 1535. After Anne Boleyn was moved away from the court, and he had to wait until the annulment to to approach her, but she refused to be his mistress. And it's pretty much what decided him to execute Anne Boleyn so that she wouldn't be present and he could marry Jane Seymour. She died 12 days after giving birth to Edward VI. And here is the traditional study that he did of Jane, sorry. Edward VI, so young. This is a delightful little baby, big cheeks, it's like he's blowing in his cheeks, and a fantastic little costume. This is the pride of the father, as you can imagine. He's also kind of mimicking these portraits where he's leaning on the parapet. The Brandon family with Henry and Charles were also painted. These were actually friends of the heir to the throne and to Edward, and they were playing companions of his. And these are very sweet little miniature made by Holbein of the two young men who unfortunately both are going to die of sweating sickness, just as the young prince will at a later age. Here is a later painting of Edward, also in that médaillon shape. One of the last works of the way by Holbein for the court, as he died that year, but also he had been kind of pushed away because he had mistaken Henry with Anne de Clèves. Christina of Denmark, who was visiting London, was also portrayed as a marvelous portrait of the young woman who was also the Duchess of Milan. and the portrait of Anne of Cleves. So this was the woman that he disliked so much that he annulled the marriage, but not even 6 months after it was consumed. Sorry. And this is, we're not sure, but this could be the portrait of Catherine Howard, the one before last of the wives of Henry. Very pretty woman, beautiful costume again, and very elaborate cuffs around there. That marvelous handling of the black with some green reflection of the wall. So we're going to take a break now so we can go on with the France. So if you have any questions, please, I see no chat, so just unmute yourself and go for it. If I can answer, I will. Unmute.
Hello?
Yes, hello.
Hi, I am actually seeing you and some of the other participants, but I'm no longer seeing the paintings and what you're trying to show.
Really?
Yes.
Who is speaking?
Bobby Lee Cranach.
Okay. Bobby, I'm so sorry. That's something that because nobody else is complaining, so I assume that must be a problem on your side.
Oh, okay.
Just check. You can remove, if you hover over the or faces or whatever, you should have. There is a little window. You have a line and then a white square.
Ah, I think I just got it.
Okay. So
yeah.
What
okay.
Smaller ones, and you should have everything there. Are you okay now?
Well, right now I see a woman in black with like a whitish veil, and okay, that's what I see now. Okay.
That's Catherine Howard.
Perfect. Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Any comments? Any questions on?
And I have a question. This is Joan.
Yes, Joan.
So all these beautiful portraits that scholars and other people like that Nikolas Katzer commissioned, were they just put them in their homes?
No,
they give them to people.
They were often exchanged with other scholars.
Oh, okay.
Between scholars, they like to have these portraits of their friends on the wall because it was an inspiration to greatness, to persevere in their.
I
role
see.
model, if you want.
I like that idea. That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, get a coffee or a glass of water, and we'll start again in about 5 minutes.
And I just have one comment.
Yes,
on that Holbein portrait of a wife and the two children.
Yeah.
I mean, I was so stunned with the man painting a woman that is so sad, and the children are so sad and sickly, and he's not disturbed by painting that of his own wife.
I really don't know. There's almost an irony from his part to actually witness the pain that he is causing.
Yeah.
So it's very much, I think, we're witnessing a crisis in the marriage there. But of course, women had little to say. And as long as she was provided for, he would say, listen, I can't do anything here, but I don't want to take you to England either. So he made her 2 more children. And then he went back to England and he died there.
He seems to be totally detached from the plight of his family. I thought this is interesting.
It was the first time when I was preparing this, it's the first time I saw this painting. I had never seen before. Before I even read the whole information side to it, I looked at it and I said, my gosh, these people look pitiful. And yeah, it's strange. You don't know. It's interesting because, for example, Dürer traveled a lot, but the last travel he did to the north, not to Italy, but to the north, he took his wife with him. And they were known not to have a good relationship. It's actually believed that Dürer was probably homosexual, but it's there we know because there's a lot of archives on Agnes and Dürer. We know that that's the problem they had, and Dürer sends letter about her that are pretty bad.
Rough.
Yeah, but traveling was such a long-winded thing at that time.
Yeah,
Go to Italy, you don't go for a week.
That's true.
So I assume they were kind of philosophical about it. In the case of Holbein's wife, she wasn't philosophical about it. She was really suffering.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, Anne.
I've got a question about the costumes. I realized it was a cold place they were living in, but I was Googling, people were only barely 5 foot tall in those days, it seems, for the most part, but they had shoulders like a Houston Oiler. And, were they built inside with, I can see the puffy sleeves on the women and stuff, but that was
multiple layers. You see, you had a shirt, and then you had kind of a blouse, and then the blouse had these big sleeves, so you would put pourpoint on top, and so on. And so it must not have been comfortable to live in. Mm-hmm. But as far as the big shoulder, remember was it in the 80s, early 80s? You remember the shoulders that suddenly all women had? Oh, yeah. They looked like football players.
But also this would make the elite look stronger and more powerful to the poor people. I think this kind of costuming.
But look at just this one.
Not just the richness of it, just the
intricacy of the embroidery on the sleeves is absolutely stunning. I love this portrait. I think it's really pretty. And we just know that she was 21, but that's all we're not sure. And they all look so much older than their age. Because you see some of these merchants, 21, 22, they look like they're 40. It's quite interesting. So anyway, I think we're going to start again. So people come back. And I'm going to come back to the view. That's it. And we're going to move to the next image, which is going to talk about, we're moving to France now. And the main figures are Francis and his son. So Francois Ier, first of all, is going to marry Claude, Duchess of Brittany, in 1513. That's under the pressure of Louis XII, who was a relative, and Louis died without heirs. And so he insisted, without any male heir. So he wanted Francis to marry his daughter Claude, who was the Duchess of Brittany. And by doing so, consolidate the fact that Brittany became French. Until then, Brittany had remained independent. In 1515, Francois Ier becomes king after the death of Louis XII. And he is going to have a life. The man was a very intelligent man. He was quite a fighter. Just early in his reign, in 1515, he actually won a big battle in Italy, where Lombardy became French for a while. And that's the Battle of Marignano. But there was a constant push. France was stuck between the Spanish Habsburg on one side and the German Habsburg on the other, with the Low Countries and the northeast. And this caused constant tension. And at the time, Francis went to the battle, became part of the Battle of Pavia. I'm sorry for that. It's the same thing as I had. And became, literally was captured during the battle in Pavia and became the prisoner of Charles V for 2 years. Became the prisoner of Charles V and for 2 years until they decided that they could send 2 of Francis' sons to replace the father, and they stayed in captivity for 4 years. But in 26, Francis came back to France. He did, though, a lot of interesting things. He actually, in 1530, declared French the national language of the kingdom, pushing Latin away. He married Eleanor of Austria, the sister of Charles V, in the second marriage, but there was no issue. He really pushed the exploration to North America and the Far East, established formal relations with the Ottoman Empire and Suleiman the Magnificent, who he met, by the way. And for us, he was a great patron of the arts. He brought Leonardo to France, who died in 1519 in Amboise. He was patron of Benvenuto Cellini, the architect Sebastiano Serlio, and painters Rosso Fiorentino, Giulio Romano, and Primaticcio, who worked quite a bit, particularly in his chateau of Fontainebleau. He sponsored construction and very important renovation of many of the royal residences, Amboise, Blois, Louvre, Le Louvre, Chambord, that he built from scratch, and Fontainebleau too, that became actually his favorite place. Also, he's the one who started the building of the City Hall in Paris. He was also a man of letters, brought in a lot of important people and really built up the library in Paris. And he died in 1547, the same year as Henry VIII, at the Château de Rambouillet, and was buried at Saint-Denis Abbey Church. Quite a colorful figure, we'll see in a minute. This is, by the way, his very small tomb, as you can see, in the Abbey Saint-Denis, Abbey Church of Saint-Denis. The painters we're going to look at are father and son. Jean Clouet, who was born in Brussels in 1486. We believe it's Brussels. Definitely, he's from the Low Countries. His real name was probably either Clouet or Clout. He's mentioned in France for the first time in 1516 and lived several years in Tours, where he was married. He moved to Paris in 1529. And a lot of the drawings that are part of the portfolio, if you can say, of the artist, were portraits of the important persons of the time of Francis I. He died in Paris in 1541. He had a son and a daughter. The daughter married really well. And we'll see about Francois Lui later on. So this is an interesting first portrait of Francois I, Francis I, as John the Baptist, made in 1518, so 3 years after Francis becomes king. And it's really interesting how there was that habit often to personalize some saints with the head, the features of important people. It also, I think, gives us an idea. You would never see Henry VIII doing the same type of things. But Francis was known to be a very literate person, and as I said, patron of the arts. Cynthia, could you mute yourself, please? Thank you. I'm going to remute all of you so we're sure we don't have any problem. Sorry for that. So this is that first portrait, but the most known is this very large portrait, 1525 to 30, showing Francis with all his regalia. And again, as we saw with Henry VIII, we have these incredibly rich costume. This also shows for Francis is his love, incredible love for the Italian Renaissance. He had gone to Italy as a warrior, but at the same time had the chance to see the art over there and enjoy the letters, and he really loved it. So this is why he's going to bring so many people, including Leonardo, to France. And this is definitely one of the masterpieces of Renaissance portraiture. The satin doublet with embroidered in gold. It's all an incredible rendering of the costume. Francis was also known for his long nose, often called Long Nose Francis. But I think there's emanates from him quite an intelligence and a depth. He is part of what we see a lot with the Clouet is these drawings. At the beginning, they were just some projects, some sketch to be made into a painting. But very quickly, they will have so much success that they will become pieces of art as a whole, just for its own sake. This portrait is going to be reproduced in enamel plaques, in medals and miniatures, by the way. He's also, of course, going to do, Jean Clouet is going to represent the whole family. So this is the delightful portrait of the son of Francois I, the Dauphin Francois, the future Henry II. Really delightful. The one with the little bonnet under his hat, and just a miniature costume, just like his father. Marguerite de Navarre was actually the sister of Henry and quite an incredible person. She was the Queen of Navarre. She was married to Henry II of Navarre, but she was really known to be a patron of humanists and reformers, which is quite interesting. There's quite an interest in the Reformed Church, but is going to become one of the outstanding figures of the French Renaissance. She was the first modern woman, according to many. She was a writer, and she just surrounded herself with great names. The costume is absolutely beautiful, and I mean, the whole look of it is very, very Italian. The portrait of Claude of Lorraine, Duc de Guise, this was another very important figure. He's going to become Duke in that period because of his support for Henry. He was actually here looking more like a courtier than a warrior, though he was a fierce soldier. And he was raised from count to duke in 1528 at the time of that portrait. And you can see Claude de Lorraine, Duc de Guise. He's going to be a very important figure in his family in the coming decades. Here is the portrait of Jean de Dinteville, who we just saw with the ambassador by Holbein. So there is a man who was painted in London and then was drawn in France. And so I bring you back the portrait of the ambassador, and you can see these two are the same. And you can see there how faithful both portraits are. And so you know that this is the way the man looked. Among the literary figures around Francis I is Guillaume Budet. He was a leading humanist. He was also at the root of the building of the library of Francis I. He is really one who built up tried to get all the books that were printed at that time in France. This, by the way, the Library of Francis became the Bibliothèque Nationale. The portrait of a man holding a volume of Petrarch is, I think, a very interesting portrait too, in the way the man is handling his look slightly on the side, the way the expression of the mouth is quite interesting. And it's almost like he stopped reading Petrarch and then just thinking of the beauty of the language. Here is the drawing that Jean-Claude did for that portrait. And then another portrait of some of the courtiers around Francis, Jean de la Barre. Also interesting to see how the detail of the face and the rest is barely sketched around it, because that was important. The costume they could put on a mannequin and paint it without any problem. But from these extremely beautiful drawings are going to come now that fad of taking the drawing and use it as a piece of art. And we'll see that coming with his son, Francois. So Francois, Jean Clouet will die just when he's crowned king in 47. So this is just at the time of the death of Jean. So let's look at Henry II, who is going to be the main patron of France, of Francois Clouet. He was born in 1519 in the royal chateau of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. As a child, Henry, who was a second boy in the family, and his elder brother spent over 4 years in captivity in Spain, and in exchange for their father. And unfortunately, the elder brother, who was Francis, named Francis, is really going to suffer from the condition they were imprisoned in later years, and it's probably what accelerated his death. Henry is going to marry Catherine of Medici in 1533. They were both 14 years old. And it's really interesting because Catherine of Medici was a commoner. She had no royal blood in her. She had a lot of money hidden behind and a lot of clout. But she was an orphan since very, very young. And so that marriage at that time was really obviously not for a reigning king, but for a second born. And unfortunately for Francis, he died. And so Henry became the heir to the throne. In 1534, so a year after his marriage, and remember, he's by that time in 34, he's 15 years old, he becomes romantically involved with a 35-year-old widow, Diane De Poitier. And that's going to remain the love of his life for the rest of his life. Very interesting woman, Diane de Poitiers. She had known him when they left to Spain. She had held him in her arms at that time and was there when he came back. And once he was of age, he became romantically involved with her. In 1536, his elder brother Francis, the Dauphin, died after a game of tennis. And this was that kind of a sweating disease that existed at that time. Some people say that he might have been poisoned, but that kind of rumor exists for anybody that dies at too young or not at the right time. The result of that is that in 1547, at the death of Francois I, Henry II is crowned King of France at Reims Cathedral. During his reign, we'll see a lot of persecution of Protestants, of the Huguenots, as they say in French. And then he is going to die pretty young in 1559 after an accident during a jousting match where the end of the lance is going to go into his eye, and he's going to have miserable 3 or 4 days before he dies. His successors are his 3 sons, and that's really interesting because this is the end of that dynasty. Francis II is only going to reign not even a full year between 59 and 60. He is the one who married Mary, Queen of the Scots. As he dies, she's going to go back to Scotland, and they had no children. Francois II is going to be succeeded by Charles IX, who will reign between 60 and 74, will marry Elizabeth of Austria, and they have 1 daughter, but no male heir. And so it's Henry III who is going to succeed and reign for about 15 years, starting 1574. Will marry, literally by love, Louise de Vaudémont without issue. And so it's the end of the dynasty, and the successor will be Henry IV, who is from Navarre. So Francois Clouet, who is the son of Jean, was born in Tours in 1510, studied with his father, was named valet de chambre, as the same way as his father was, by the way, to Henry II, which was quite a title. It was not to be a butler, but that was a high level within the hierarchies of the court, for artists at least. One of the biggest commission he's going to get is going to be by Catherine of Medici, the wife of Henri II, to make portraits of the entire court in drawings. And this was kind of collated and in the binding. And at the death of Catherine of Medici, it's her granddaughter who is going to go back to Italy, who is going to have that with her. And then the portraits are going to be a little bit disseminated, and they will be bought by a big family in England until they were discovered by the Duke of, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name in France, the owner of the Chateau of Chantilly, who is going to buy them. And there's the biggest collection of the Clouets are in the Chateau of Chantilly, beautifully displayed, but as you know, it's work on paper. It cannot be exhibited for more than 2 months at a time. And then Francois Clouet died in Paris. We know very little about these painters. As you see, there's not been a real research on these 2 painters, but most of the archives have disappeared during the revolutions. So you can believe that Francois worked with Jean for a long time before Jean died. And this is really interesting to see these 2 portraits of Francis, equestrian portrait, one by Jean on the left and the one by Francois on the other. And you can see how they follow one another. Of course, these were supposed to be very similar. But the same thing, Francois is going to work for the court. So this is one of the portraits of Henry II that just after Henry ascended the throne. He was in many ways an informal man. He wasn't looking for being, to becoming king, but in general was less formal than a king would have been before. Beautiful clothes also. One of the drawings, and this becomes now, as you can see, a little more finished, a little more about the details of the costume. These are going to be part of that whole series that is commissioned by Catherine of Medici, of the entire court. Also commissioned by Catherine is the couple of Henry and Catherine, surrounded by their children and their wives. They both had 10 children, by the way. 6 of them never made it beyond 2 years of age. Like many of the times, Francois Lui will also make a lot of miniatures. These were easy painting to carry around, to have with you of your dear one. And this is a little miniature you can find at the Victoria and Albert. And this is a small painting showing Catherine after the death of her husband, where she remained in a widow garb for the rest of her life, always dressed in black. Catherine was a very highly intelligent woman, very politically astute, and she is going to manipulate everything with her 3 sons after the death of Henry. She was known not to be a beauty. She was rather homely in appearance, had the typical bulging eyes of the Medicis. But she was only 14 when Henry married her. And interestingly enough, the Pope Clement called the marriage the greatest match in the world. But we know that the union was going to bring Catherine a lot of sorrow and personal sacrifice. And it's really interesting is that Diane De Poitier, who was the mistress of Henry VII, insisted in Henry to go to bed with his wife, to keep on having children. But Diane De Poitier will have tremendous influence on the administration too, before the death of Henry. Once Henry died, Catherine took her favorite castle from her, which is the Chenonceau, if you have been along the Loire Valley. She took that chateau that had been given to Diane de Poitiers by Henry, and then sent Diane to a stronghold instead of the beautiful chateau of Chenonceau. Francois II de Valois, the eldest of the son, lovely, very lively face, extremely well rendered, give an idea of the vivacity of the young man. The second son, Charles IX, in 61, and then a little later, so this is probably about 3-4 years difference between the two of them. So one is a drawing, the other one is a painting. Charles, at that time in 69, he's becoming king, so we see him a more formal representation. And his delightful wife, Elizabeth of Austria, daughter of the Emperor Maximilian II and Mary of Austria. Again, extraordinary costume with the detailed pearls that are embroidered in the top, and then larger pearls and rubies and garnets, everything. Beside the royal family itself, we have, of course, the courtiers. This is Francois de Lorraine, Duc de Guise, the important figure who is going to finally be assassinated by Henry III. But very strong representation of a man who was incredibly powerful around the court. Sorry. Odette Coligny, Cardinal de Châtillon, he was a cardinal. He was Bishop-elect of Beauvais, Peer of France, and a member of the French Royal Council. Young men again, but these tasks were offered to all the important figures. You can see the incredibly intricate embroidery and fabric used for these costumes. Marguerite d'Angoulême, so she is the same as we saw before, but older. This is the Queen of Navarre, the wife, the sister of Francis I, a great woman. And then outside of the court, a friend of Francois Clouet. He lived in the same street. He was an apothecary. You can see that he has a beautifully illustrated book next to him that shows his interest in nature and a much more relaxed, less formal type of portrait because it was for him. But Francois is also known for some really interesting painting directly influenced by the Mannerist period that existed in Italy and that were imported by the whole series of painters like Fiorentino and Primaticcio, etc. And so this shows the bath of Diana. Of course, Diana was the mistress of Henry II. And so she's often represented as the goddess Diana. And we have actually the peaking Henry II who is passing by on his horse and looking at the delightful view of the goddess being attended by her nymphs. Le billet doux, that again has everything to do with Diane. We find her features again. It's always puzzled people that she's shown dressed so lightly, if we can say. But this seemed to be that we have become more conservative than they were in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. So here is, you can see the old woman having a little note written by the suitor on the other side. And then the more known painting of a lady in her bath that shows the lady in the nude from the waist up, a kind of a strange looking nursing lady there at the back with probably the child of the same woman. And this is most probably representing Diane De Poitier, who was known to be a very pretty woman. And then you have a servant in the back who is putting some hot water in the tub. Very strange to our eyes, but were corresponding to some of the culture of the time. Remember the Venus of Urbino with Titian. So these things were not reproved by people the way they are now. So there's going to be quite a follow-up to both Holbein, who's really created that new style in London, and then by the Clouet, which is going to have a pretty broad school of draftsmen behind them. So I'm going to show you a great miniature painter, a limner, as they say, is Nicolas Hilliard, who was the son of a goldsmith and really became the miniaturist, the limner in London. Probably one of my favorite is The Young Man Among Roses. It shows that really relaxed young men in very beautiful attire, but in a garden of wild roses, probably the Earl of Essex. And then the miniature by the same Nicolas Hilliard of Elizabeth I. Otherwise, there is that continuation. And after Francois Lui, it's really difficult sometimes to make the difference between the different painters, craftsmen, like Jean de Cour and others. There are many of them that are going to continue that tradition of these court portraits. This is Henri Duc d'Anjou, the future Henry III. Was known, by the way, for his elegance. He was surrounded by his mignons, and therefore many people thought that he was gay 100%, but he was also known to have lots of affairs with women, so probably was ambidextrous. And here is Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre. That's the mother of the future Henry IV, the school of Francois Clouet. So this went on until the 17th century. So on this, I will open the, let me stop the recording.